You're listening to Whoa! Potluck.
And hey, you're listening to Books and Boba, a book club and podcast featuring books by Asian and Asian American authors. My name is Marvin Yue.
And I'm Rira Yu.
And we are here today for an author chat with Tara Sim, who joins us to talk about her latest novel, We Shall Be Monsters, a YA horror adventure combining Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with Indian mythology. As always, Books and Boba is supported in part by our listeners over at patreon.com/booksandboba. So if you'd like to become a bigger part of our podcast, head on over. Our Patreon supporters gain access to our members-only Discord server, as well as monthly bonus podcasts. So definitely appreciate everyone who has supported us so far.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed our chat with Tara. We talked about video games. We talked about Indian mythology and how much scarier Asian ghosts are compared to Western ghosts. It was a really fun chat, and I hope you guys enjoy listening to it.
Yeah, so without further ado, here is our conversation with Tara Sim.
And we are here with Tara Sim, the author of the Dark Gods trilogy, the Scavenger Stars duology, and the Timekeeper trilogy. And we are here to talk about her latest book, We Shall Be Monsters. Welcome to the show, Tara.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
So this is a little bit different from how we start our chats, but I heard that you play video games on your time off, and Marvin and I are big gamers.
Oh,
so,
good.
Is there a game that you're playing right now, or what are your favorite games?
Oh, so right now I'm in the middle of making slow progress on Final Fantasy 16.
Oh, that's like one of my favorites. Yeah.
Yeah. I just played Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, and Final Fantasy 7 is one of like my top favorite video games of all time. And so I'm having a blast with the remake, honestly. And so I was just, still in that Final Fantasy mood. And so I was like, oh, I didn't get to 16 last year, so I should really get in that. But I've also been on deadline crunch, so it's been very slow going, but I'm having fun with it.
Yeah. Rira, you finished 16, right? I have not.
I did.
I made it through the third chapter, and I haven't picked it up since.
I love 16 because it's such a different vibe from the other Final Fantasy games. Because like early Final Fantasy, I mean, it was like more like European medieval fantasy, and then it like moved to more steampunk, and then we had like a brief moment where it was like more Asian inspired, and then like for was it 15? It was like more like super modern.
It was very American, yeah.
Yeah. So like. This time around, like going more Game of Thrones, I was like, okay, yeah, this is totally my vibe. So I was very excited. And, it's interesting that you're into Final Fantasy right now because it's such a time commitment game.
Yes.
I thought you were going to say like Stardew Valley or something that's like more
I love Stardew
forgiving.
Valley.
Stardew Valley is also like 100-hour commitment, though. Like that game
I was going to
is a time
say...
suck.
I was going to say, Stardew Valley is also, like, I probably have hundreds of hours clocked into Stardew right now.
I feel like it's, like, more casual, though. Like, you can, like, because it's not, like, heavily story-based. Especially with 16, all the side quests are tied into the main quest. Not to spoil everybody's fun if you guys haven't played it yet, but it's a great game. So... That was our little icebreaker, our little nerd moment. But I read in a past interview that you wrote your first novel when you were 15. So I'm guessing that you were kind of encouraged to write at a young age. Can you kind of tell us like how you got the writing bug?
Yeah, so I think, honestly, I probably just inherited it from my dad. Like, he was always kind of like tinkering with like his little journals and and like writing and stuff like that. I've always loved like reading and books and fantasy especially. So I think my dad really fostered that love of reading and writing in me. And when I was around like 11, 12 years old was when like the first Lord of the Rings movie came out. And I became absolutely obsessed. I read all the books. I was like, this is so cool. I already love fantasy, but what if this is fantasy on like a massive scale. What if I could do that too? And then I was just like completely enthralled with, creating my own characters and like worlds to put them in and situations to put them in. And it's been my obsession ever since.
I'm just amazed that a 15-year-old could write a novel, like a full novel. I could barely write, like I mentioned this before, I could barely write like a 5-page paper.
Yeah. Well, the difference between like writing for school or like writing for myself was that I just like, for me, all of it was the characters. Just, I loved them so much that I was like, I want to put them into all of these different situations and like give them like swords and stuff. So like the book wasn't good. It was, full of every fantasy cliche that you can possibly think of. But like back then I was reading stuff like The Wheel of Time, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, and that all of that just kind of like fused in my brain.
So how did you go on this path to becoming a professional author? Because obviously it's very different writing as a hobby versus, querying and getting an agent and all of that.
Absolutely. And I do kind of miss like just writing without the business side of it because it's so much more like, freeing. Like back when I was a teenager writing these big cliche epic fantasy books, it's like I could do whatever I want. But now when I sit down to write my epic fantasy books, I'm like, oh God, I have to actually like make this good. I think the path was long, and arduous because the path of finding an agent can be, very time consuming, very like hard on you mentally and emotionally. Because I think a lot of writers will kind of tie their self-worth into their writing, which, you shouldn't do, but like it just happens anyway. It's just like a fact that it happens. So it's like a rejection from someone is like, oh, you're rejecting me as a person. No, not true. But it's, that whole process of like getting the agent and then going out on submission. It was very like tough, especially the first time. It's still tough now, but I'm more used to it, more used to the business side of things. But yeah, it didn't take like in hindsight, it really did not take that long to do that whole process of like getting immersed in the writing community, finding an agent, getting a book deal. But it felt like it took 10 lifetimes.
And for when you like first got your agent and first start like querying, was it a book that you had already ended up publishing, or is it like a manuscript that was just in your drawer for a while?
It was what would become my debut book, which is Timekeeper. So that was the book that I queried and published. I did query another book before then, which unfortunately was shelved a long time ago, but I only queried 2 agents and got rejections from them. So I don't really count it.
So for our listeners who have not kind of kept up to date with publishing news, can you tell us about your new book, We Shall Be Monsters?
Yes. So it's been a hot minute since I have published a young adult book. I think since like 2021 was when my last one came out. So I'm kind of getting back into the YA space with a new YA fantasy. It's kind of like horror fantasy. It has kind of like a gothic vibe to it. It's basically, I like to pitch it as Frankenstein meets Indian mythology. Taking a lot of the themes of Frankenstein and a lot of the creatures and such from Indian mythology and kind of combining them into its own unholy child.
What inspired you to, write your take on the Frankenstein mythos?
I wish I could take like all the responsibility for it, but it was actually fellow author Danielle Clayton who wrote The Bells and The Marvelers. She, a long, long time ago, like back in 2016, I think, she told me that she wanted to see my take on Frankenstein, but make it Indian. And I was like, that is incredible. Like, I love Frankenstein. Like, this is absolutely my jam. one day I'm going to write this book. And then eventually I did.
I love
it took
how
a long time to. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was gonna say it's like, oh, that's like really cool. You're just like, I'm gonna do it. Like,
yeah, it took a while to like actually figure out what the story was going to be and how I was going to include like a Frankenstein theme into something that's Indian. And that's where like my research took me into like a deep dive of Indian mythology and like how it married really perfectly with like the horror genre, and like kind of has this gothic vibe to the book that I really wanted from the start. So I'm very thankful to Danielle for putting the seed in my head.
yeah, I have to say, like, I love the secondary world that you built around Indian mythology, especially since, when we read fantasies these days, I mean, luckily we are getting more Asian inspired and like, other like BIPOC inspired fantasies around like our own mythologies, but it's been largely populated by, medieval fantasy Europe.
Yes.
And not to say like those settings are like not cool, but it's been nice to see the canon, see that genre expanding to include other mythologies, like I said. So I'm just curious as to like, how did you build your secondary world in this book? How did you know like which myths you're gonna like pull out and kind of spin it into your own story?
Well, first of all, thank you for the compliment. I love world building. It's something that like I feel like I wasn't very good at when I first started writing fantasy. And it's something that I've really trained myself to be very like diligent in and do a lot of research for. But so long as the research is like fun, if that makes sense. Because like if I'm not having a fun time, my readers are not going to have a fun time. So in researching Indian mythology, I really wanted to, I didn't want to focus on like Hindu gods or anything like that. I really wanted to go in a more like Buddhist direction where it's very heavily like nature inspired. And Buddhism and Hinduism, they kind of share a lot of the same core concepts, a lot of the same mythology, even if some things kind of look different between them. Like, so the demons and spirits, the Rakshasas and the Yakshas, those are kind of a play on these like ancient demons from India, where the Yakshas are more like spiritual, nature focused, but like they can be mischievous and bad as well. The Rakshasas are more kind of like animalistic, a little bit portrayed more evil or demony, but like they can be good too. So I really wanted to have this really interesting dichotomy in the mythology of like, here's what has been historically considered bad and historically considered good, and then kind of make a play on that. And so that was kind of the core idea of the world between like the Rakshasas and the Yakshas, and how that kind of plays into the balance of the magic of this world.
Yeah, I really like that. Like Rita said, a lot of fantasy that we're used to reading growing up takes a lot from like Christian iconography. So demons, angels, good versus evil. And I really love that how your book plays in those conventions, but also like, yeah, creates that more like there's no good and evil. It's just what people place, like what people put on them to categorize them. And like, much like other Frankenstein stories, the people are really the problem here, their fears and
Yes.
their prejudices, right?
Exactly. Yep. And that's kind of what I wanted to strike with this book too. It's like, oh, these beings are the monsters, or like this horrible demon person is the monsters. Like, no, I think it's actually just the humans that are actually the monsters.
Yeah, the monster part is definitely in our actions and our consequences, which is a theme that clearly shows throughout your book. There's a lot of
Yes.
consequences, you guys. I don't want to spoil anything, but a lot happens in this book. But when this book was pitched to me as Indian mythology meets Frankenstein, and you have your main character, Kajal, try to resurrect her sister, I was just like, is this gonna be like Full Metal Alchemist, where like where like human transmutation is forbidden? But surprisingly, it was very like straightforward, being like, okay, we just have to collect the materials and this is possible. So I am curious as to like, how did you come up with the rules to like resurrection and, you know, dealing with the spiritual world?
Yeah, it was a little bit of trial and error because, like you said, I didn't want to just like emulate Full Metal Alchemist because that's kind of like the Bible when it comes to like the resurrection, the price of resurrection and stuff like that. But there are some consequences to like not doing it correctly in this world. So not really a spoiler because it happens at the very beginning of the book, but Kajal resurrects a dog and she doesn't do it quite correctly. So like the dog is not able to eat. So, and people can tell that there's something like a little off about this dog, and so she's like, oh shoot, so I have to like perfect this resurrection method before I can use it on my sister. And for this I wanted to tap even more into like Indian culture by using this ancient medical practice called Ayurveda, which is what Kajal uses throughout the book. And it's basically like using a lot of like plants and food and different types of like energy restoration exercises and stuff like that, and which is where yoga came from, to kind of like help maintain the body and like make sure that you're healthy and stuff like that. And I wanted to use this kind of like, you know, ancient medical practice in a more fantasy way. I originally wanted it to be a little bit more steampunky, but my editor was like, editors don't like science or metal in their fantasy books. And I was like, boy, do I know it. So I had to kind of take out all the metal bits, all the science-y bits, and kind of more focus on the magic of it and how it kind of married into this this medical practice. So a lot of stuff with like the chakras that kind of like circulate the body and like making sure that like everything is in working order. So like you said, it is a bit more straightforward. There are some consequences, but it could be stuff that I, you know, handle more in book 2. Who can say?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for including the undead good boy Kuta, the undead puppy in your stories. Was including an animal companion like was that something that, when did that come about in planning out the story? Like,
you know what? I honestly do not remember. Like, I don't remember the exact point where I was like, I need a zombie dog in this book. He is heavily modeled after the German Shepherd I grew up with, who was like the smartest dog that I have ever met. There was at one point where my editor was like, would a dog do this? And I was like, yes, because mine did. Like, I think at some points in the book, like, he will give Kajal like this kind of look like, are you kidding me? And I was like, my dog would give me this exact look all the time. But yeah, I can't actually remember like the point where I had it, but like, obviously it happens like in chapter 1, right? So I knew very early on that there was going to be an animal companion, and I don't know, sometimes I just love me an animal companion.
Yeah, I was really surprised in the beginning that she resurrected a dog first, because it like jumps time, right? Being like, oh, 5 months later. And I'm like, oh, okay, like she's going to resurrect her sister now. And there's going to be, you know, like consequences to like bringing back the dead. But I was like, oh no, this is a good boy dog. And
yeah. I love that moment, because that's exactly what I want from the readers too, where they're like, oh, she's digging up a body. Is this her sister? Is she going to do? It's a dog.
It's a dog. It's funny how, you know, you said you had to take out the science bits of like the magic system in your book, because the world, in the world there is a university, and they are trying to kind of invalidate the old healing ways, and they want to be more scientific, which is kind of strange because they're studying mythology and like demonology and chakras, and I'm just like, okay, like how much more scientific is this compared to the olden ways? So can you tell us about like how that idea came to place, having like modernity versus old traditions?
So like with a lot of my things, with a lot of my books that I've written, I came to realize eventually that all of this was basically just an analogy for colonialism.
Amazing. Yes.
Because I was like, I took a look at it, and I think it was during like revisions with my editor where I was like, this is just another analogy for colonialism. I did it again. So that kind of like push and pull of like bringing more kind of like, quote unquote, Western technology into something that's like thrived with like ancient practices and Ayurveda, like I mentioned before, that kind of that push and pull between them was kind of like the core conflict of that university, where it's like they really want to teach these old ways and these old practices because they've endured for a reason and they're important for a reason. But then you have this new guy coming in and being like, no, that's silly. Don't do that. You need to do it this way because it's better and more efficient, even though it ends up making people suffer because of it. So, and then you have Kajal, the main character, who is very scientific in nature. Like I joke that she is a girl in STEM because, she, in addition to like the kind of magical elements, like she is very like observant of the world around her. She wants to know how things work. And, she has a scalpel and, I love envisioning her as this little like scientist in the making. So there is like as much of a scientific element that I could put in it. But making it very kind of like at odds with the magical component.
Yeah. I mean, Kajal's always running around saying, my experiments, right? So
my experiments, yeah.
I do love how she's just like, okay, like I need to check if like the digestive system is working properly. Yeah. Oh, okay, like you're sweating. That's really good. And I'm just like, oh my God, I love this nerd. She's great. But So this book is filled with like demons, ghosts, spirits. Do you have a favorite type of monster? It doesn't have to be within your book, but just like generally.
I've always been a fan of vampires. And I do blame Anne Rice for this. I was never a Twilight girly. That was like a little past my time and like not quite the tone that goes for me. But when I was in high school, I read Interview with the Vampire and I was like, this is mind changing, life altering. I love this so much. And ever since then, I've just like really loved vampires. I love just like really gnarly stuff too. Like the things that don't really have any like cultural placement, but are just like invented as these big like gnarly creatures. Like I just love anything like that, especially if it's in like a horror context where, especially if you can't see them all the way, like to me, that's scarier than seeing like a big thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of cosmic horror myself and all the weird things we can't explain. It does make sense that your inspirations came from Anne Rice and her sexy vampires because you have a couple of sexy Frankenstein monsters in this book.
I do, absolutely. She was a big inspiration for me back in the day.
Yeah. What I really loved about your book was that I didn't know where to go next. Like it starts off as like this adventure of this girl trying to like escape being hunted / like, being blackmailed and going on adventures in the battlefields. But then it shifts into like an academy story and you have like snobby classmates and like high elites. Can you tell us about how the university setting came to be?
Yeah. When I was kind of like putting together the story after, Danielle was like, hey, you should write an Indian Frankenstein. And I was like, all right, bet. In the years where I was kind of like developing it, I was like, oh, there should be a university. And in the years following that, dark academia became a big thing. But not so much like dark academia, like exploring like BIPOC issues, like, or culture and stuff like that. And so I was like, I kind of want to do like my own spin on dark academia without this being a dark academia book. And so that's why the university is kind of like the midpoint of the story, because you have Kajal starting out, destitute. She's running from these witch hunters. It's just her and then her dog, kind of coming in out of the wild. And then you've got the university as kind of like this cornerstone of how she begins to change, and how she sees like the state of the country. And then later in the book, when you move past the university, you go back into the wild, seeing even more of this world and how it's changing. And so I kind of wanted that to be the bookend with the university in the middle. I feel like the university had a bigger role in my like initial conception of the story. But then as I was writing it, I was like, I don't want to set all of it here because it feels very like claustrophobic after a while. So it's mostly when Kajal is doing like her big experiment, like you said, at the university. It just felt correct to me.
Yeah, one of my favorite scenes at the university was when we meet Dalbir. I think that's how we pronounce their name. But they tell Kajal like their preferred pronouns, and there's like no argument, no questions. It's like no fuss, and like Kajal's like, okay, my pronouns are she, her. I don't know why like this is a thing, but okay, we're just gonna roll with it. And I love how like it was just like not even like an issue. And I know that your past books have queer representation as well, and they've also had that like safe space, you know, where there's not hate crimes or prejudice, really. So what has been the best part of creating that space for your readers? And have you heard any feedback from the readers who are queer and have read your books?
Yeah, absolutely. I've gotten several messages from readers to be like, this was, amazing, and like it's to see myself in this kind of world without having to worry about our world's problems being in them. Because like I do, like especially with like my first series, Timekeeper, it's an alt history of London. Victorian London. And I knew pretty early on that I didn't want to have like any homophobia involved. Like there is still like some homophobia that happens, but it's not considered a crime in this alt universe that I've created. And readers were very happy for that, because they were like, oh, good, I can read a historical without like having that one moment where it's like, oh, and I was like, yes, I also hate those moments in historical books. And so I have provided one for you without that. And then in subsequent books, I always try to create a world that is just very, everything is normalized, basically. So in We Shall Be Monsters, stuff like Dalbir saying their pronouns is like completely like, yeah, fine, dude. That's totally okay. But then at the same time, you also have this like raging misogyny happening in the world as well. So it's like, I get rid of some things, but I also keep other things to like have, if they provide a purpose, right, for the book. And in the case of We Shall Be Monsters, there's a very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's in India, there's a lot of witch hunts that still happen to this day because of that raging misogyny. And so I kind of wanted to highlight that in We Shall Be Monsters. So not in a way that would make my readers feel unsafe, but just in a way that my readers could read it and be like, oh, yeah, that's pretty bad. We should be aware of this.
Yeah, and also you give like that context of, well, there's magic in this world, there's a blight going on, and they need people to blame. So obviously they're gonna blame the girl who has no family and has a weird dog that doesn't eat. So there is context around it. Your previous novel, City of Dusk, I mean, it was your first adult fantasy book. And you said it's been a while since you've gone back to the YA space. How has that been? And also, I know that City of Dusk had like 4 POVs. It's epic fantasy. It's very ambitious. How is it switching back to like single POV and like a little bit more of a streamlined arc?
That is a fantastic question. And the answer is that I loved it. Yeah, City of Dusk, my Dark Gods trilogy actually has 7 POVs across all 3 books.
Oh, wow.
It used to have 8. I dropped it down to 7. My editor was like, any more that we can cut? And I was like, no. Yes. So it, like you said, it is my most ambitious project to date. I'm actually just finishing up my first draft of book 3 like this week. So I've been like on that deadline crunch for a while, but I'm very like pleased and proud with how it came out. And I love all these characters. I would not go back in time and drop a single one of them. But going back to like a single POV, and then something that's like more streamlined, like you said, with that YA tends to be with like a faster pacing and stuff like that, was very like freeing because I was like, oh, I can just focus on this one character and her journey. It's going to be like half the size of this other book, and I can just like take my time with these small details, and it was great.
Yeah, I mean, like, I can just imagine, you know, like those conspiracy boards with like the red threads. That's probably what it was for your adult fantasy plotting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can't see it behind me, but I do have a board behind me where I've laid out all of these different note cards with different things that happened in the climax that I just drafted last week. It definitely looks like some sort of crime scene investigation.
Yeah. Instead, you write about a young character with a conspiracy board inside of her own head, because she's always thinking, because, you know, she is a scientist, she's always doing experiments, but she's also racked with guilt, always literally haunted by the ghost of her regrets. How was it to get back into the mind of like a young adult protagonist?
I feel like for me, it's not that difficult. Because a lot of times I will just, I don't know, I feel like I still kind of have the mind of a teenager sometimes. Like, obviously, I've grown up quite a bit since I was like 16, 17 years old. My mind is completely different than how it was then. But once in a while, especially if I return to like a story that I really loved when I was in high school, or like an anime that I used to watch or something like that, it kind of like puts me back into that mentality a little bit. Not long lasting, thank God, but it just like reminds me of like what it was like to be a teenager, to be like taking in information, learning about how the world around me works, without all like the jadedness of being an adult, if that makes sense.
No, totally get it. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, I feel like when you're a teenager, your world is so small, and naturally you're selfish, self-centered, always just considering how is this going to affect me versus how is this going to affect everybody else around me, and like
yes,
the
exactly.
community. I mean, obviously some people have not grown into that mindset. They're still very self-centered.
Yeah.
But I thought you portrayed Kajal's grief and like desperation really well to save her sister. It was very like, I thought the grief just kind of like bleeded off of the page. I felt so bad for her. Can you tell us about like how you developed their bond, and also like how important was siblinghood in your book, because that is a recurring theme?
Yeah, for sure. Siblinghood is like one of the major, parts of the book. And in like different facets as well. Something that my editor asked me once is, she asked me, how can you write sibling dynamics so well when you're an only child? And
You're
I was like,
only child?
I am an only child. But my answer is the same as the answer I'm going to give now, which is that both my parents come from having strong sibling bonds. And so watching like my dad interact with his siblings and watching my mom interact with her siblings like throughout my whole life gave me this idea of sibling bonding. And my first cousins as well on my mother's side, I see how like two brothers interacted versus how two sisters interacted. And so that was kind of like, not like I didn't base the siblings in the book off of my cousins whatsoever. They are super completely different. But like it kind of gave me that little like seedling idea of like, okay, so I'm gonna approach these two this way and then these two this way. So in the terms of Kajal and her sister Lasya, they have a very like codependent relationship. Kajal really depends on Lasya to be like the nice one, the one who kind of handles the talking. She's the one who handles people because Kajal's weakness is other people. Like she can't handle it. No one really likes her. She's very off-putting. But Lasya is like a little bit too nice. And so Kajal is there to be like the mean cop, to make sure that nobody takes advantage of Lasya. She's there to like negotiate for things where Lasya can't. And so they kind of have this dynamic of being like the good one and the bad one. And Kajal really like internalizes this. And so a big part of her grief is that like the wrong sister died, basically, is like kind of how she's approaching this. She's like, Lasya was like so good and like perfect. And like, how can she die? How can I have played a role in that? I really must be like as bad as people say. And then the reader will kind of gradually unearth their relationship to be like, no, it's more complicated than that. Like, it's not quite what Kajal is making it out to be. She just kind of, they, like I said, they have this codependent relationship where they rely on each other so much they can't really see the outside world as much as they can. So with Kajal gone and separated from her sister, she really begins to like understand how other people think and grow close to other people, albeit unwillingly, and figure out like what life actually like looks like without her sister.
I'm still reeling from the fact that you are an only child because siblinghood is such a big part. And like, I actually have in my questions, like, oh, do you have siblings? Like, what is like your sibling dynamic? But wow, that is really shocking to me.
So growing up, the cousins that I mentioned before, my first cousins on my mother's side, I grew up very close to all four of them. And I'm like right in the middle age-wise. And so like, I kind of know what it's like to have two different kinds of older brothers and two different kinds of younger sisters, albeit ones that I don't live with, which is like the good part, I guess. But like when I was younger, like my eldest cousin, he would like terrorize me and I would always like fight back. And then the other one was like really nice and he helped me learn how to tie my shoes and stuff like that. So I kind of have these little moments with them growing up that I think, I would have otherwise shared with a sibling. It's not quite the same thing, but it is kind of like a big, the basis for how I kind of perceive sibling relationships.
Yeah. I mean, the real answer should just be, you're just that good of a writer, right?
That's true.
Yeah. I mean, your job is to make up shit. So It makes sense. I mean, before we started this recording, Marvin and I were talking about like all the things that kind of caught us off guard in the third act. And I'm not going to say what they are because of spoilers. But one of the big surprises that we had was, oh, this is a series. This is like a duology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And granted, this is probably because we probably should have known. This probably was in like the brief your publisher sent us that, oh, it's book one of a duology. We went in assuming it was a complete story.
Standalone.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But I told Marvin, I was like, oh, it makes sense that this book would be a duology because everything is about balance. You have siblings, like it like makes sense. But looking at your bio, like you've written trilogies and duologies. Have you ever tried writing a standalone, or like have you like did you write a standalone and it just like became a monstrosity where you're just like, okay, I need to like actually split this into like two or three books?
Yeah, so I have written some like shelved standalones like years ago, and originally Timekeeper, my debut book, was supposed to be a standalone, and then I got to the end of it and I was like, oh no, the story is so much bigger than I thought it was. This has to be a trilogy. I think my mind just naturally works with series, especially trilogies. I think it's just because I grew up reading so much fantasy and so much like adult fantasy that like really takes its time to develop. that kind of gave me this foundation of like, just naturally being like, this will be a trilogy. But I do, like, especially after finishing the Dark Gods trilogy, I really want to take a break from them for just a little bit. So I do have 2 standalone ideas for my next adult fantasy. So fingers crossed that I can write one or both of them. But yeah, I'm not done with series, obviously. Like I will write at least one standalone in my career, I swear.
I was reading through like your third act and saying like there's not that many chapters left and we're really getting started here. Like how is Tara gonna wrap it all up? It's like no, it's a tease. There's more to come.
My anxiety
There's more to
really
come.
my anxiety really skyrocketed. I'm like, oh my God, I'm on the last 60 pages and there's so many unresolved things, like so many things can go wrong. But that just shows how well you wrote the tension. And I don't know, it's just like funny how you're like more prone to writing series, because you said earlier that Lord of the Rings was like a big
Yes.
like influence on your love for fantasy. And I think about how Tolkien, Lord of the Rings was not meant to be a trilogy. It was meant to be a ginormous tome of a book. And then the publishers were like, no, we have to split it up. And he was so mad about it too.
He was so angry, but like, I get it, man. It's like, it's technically, when you look at the books, it's technically like 6 books in a trilogy trench coat, which is hilarious to me. But yeah, I love that story. How he was like, no, I don't want it this way. And his editor was like, you got to do it.
It's like, you got to do it. It's like 1,000 pages at this point. It is thicker than the Bible at this point.
More than 1,000 pages. Yeah, absolutely. I think I was definitely very much inspired by Lord of the Rings in terms of like structure, especially with the movies too. I had just rewatched the trilogy recently and I was like, wow, yeah, I just really take a lot of my series structure from the Lord of the Rings. Because like usually in a book 2, my characters will be split up. And then in the third one, there's always like this big, climactic battle and stuff like that. So I was like, yeah, this is
I mean, it works.
The foundation.
It works.
Yeah.
So why mess with it?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I feel like YA horror, it's still like a very small category within YA, but it's growing. Like She Is the Haunting by Tran Tan Tran, like it reached like the New York Times like bestsellers list. And we also have Gorgeous Gruesome Faces by Linda Cheng. And I'm just like curious as to like what your thoughts are on like this growing subgenre. Why do you think it's gaining popularity now?
I'm not I feel like I don't have as much insight into why it's growing now, but I do feel like over the past several years, horror like as a whole has really taken off like across all media. And this could be related, but like I feel when I was younger, I thought I didn't like horror because at the time, horror was mostly just like slasher, right? It was just like blood flying everywhere and stuff. And I was like, that's boring and gross. I don't care about that. But then within like the last decade or so, horror has really become this like really like philosophical, and it a lot of the time also it's about grief. Like I feel like 90% of horror is just about like loss or grief or trauma. And so I think like in the world that we live in, unfortunately, more and more people are experiencing these feelings and kind of when they turn to media for comfort, they, like me, started turning to horror to be like, this is what resonates within me right now. This dread that I can not, I don't feel it in my body. I feel it like in this character instead. And so I feel like horror is very therapeutic in a way. And it could be one of the reasons why it's been taken off so much within the last few years. And especially in YA, these teenagers have a lot of pent up emotions that they feel like they can't safely explore. And in young adult like what we were talking about before with like me creating safe spaces in my secondary worlds, YA should be there for them to help them kind of like overcome these challenges, especially like their mental challenges, these emotional things that they may not have a safe person to go to explore them. And I think horror is a great way to do that. Because I don't know, I just feel like it's, like I said, therapeutic.
Yeah, I mean, the books that we were mentioned, also your book as well, also are part of like a rising, I guess, tide of horror that takes inspiration from non-Western mythos and mythologies. What are your thoughts
and
about?
I love that.
Of that, yeah.
I mean, we have cooler ghosts.
Yeah. That's true. I saw a tweet recently that was about like how like Southeast Asia is that like they're all connected. All those countries are connected by like their ghost stories and like how deeply like superstitious they are. And I was like, I can absolutely see that. Like I just read this big book on like ghosts, monsters, and demons of India, and there's so many of them. Like all of this different folklore from all across the subcontinent, and like we just have really cool and like sometimes really weird types of ghosts and monsters.
Our ghosts are angrier, our monsters are weirder, our gods are angrier too,
Yes, absolutely, for sure. And like, even though, I do love the whole like European medieval fantasies, like I'll always love that. That'll always be there for me. I love Western things like, vampires and stuff, but like exploring those more cultural myths, the things that are like really rooted in your culture. Like I find it so fascinating. And I love this trend of horror coming out from all across like all these different cultures and stuff. Like, yes, feed me your strange, weird monsters. I love it.
Yeah. Especially you mentioned like, Hindu mythology, like those legends and myths they're like action stories. They're like action movies. Right. And, I know, is that something that you'll be exploring more in your next book, or can you give us a quick? I don't know if you've started working on it yet, but a quick preview on like what to expect.
Yeah. So for book 2, obviously there's still like a big mythologies is still a big component. There's definitely a lot more action, but there's also this doesn't really spoil anything, but like a lot more exploration of like what the Indian underworld is kind of perceived as. And like a lot of times throughout different cultures, the underworld is something that's like really spooky and dark and whatever. But like in Indian mythology, the underworld is like, its beauty rivals heaven, honestly. So like, I'm really excited to explore more of that and kind of have like my own take on things while also kind of taking inspiration from the mythology surrounding it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I remember being excited when we read Yanxi Chu's The Ghost Bride, which explores like the Chinese underworld, which is kind of like a bureaucracy down there. It's like a lot of administrative queuing. So,
yes, I love that about it.
not as fun as the Indian underworld, like you're describing. It's funny how. Like with Underworlds, I'm currently playing Hades right now, the indie game.
I love Hades, yes.
Yeah, and it's just been very funny because I know so much about Greek mythology. I went through a phase when I was a girl, and a lot of that knowledge just kind of like stuck in my brain. So when my partner and I are playing the game, I'm just like, oh, did you know that Zagreus and Dionysus are like the same person in like Orphic tales and blah, 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 blah. But while I was reading your book, I was like, oh, I really know nothing about Indian mythology. And if I think about it, I don't really know that much about Asian mythology. So I've been like really thankful that books like yours and other authors of color are writing their own spin on mythologies. So I welcome it. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So as we find ourselves at the end of our conversation, you mentioned that you're working on a bunch of stuff right now, but anything coming down the pipe that you want to let our listeners know about?
Well, I mean, next week, We Shall Be Monsters comes out at the time of recording this. I'll be going on a little West Coast tour, hitting up San Francisco, Portland, San Diego, LA. And beyond that, I'm just going to be working on my books. Just like really kind of shackled to my computer as I finish it.
Well, best of luck to
Thank you.
Drafting and deadlines. I cannot imagine the stress you're going through right now with a new book coming out this week, and also just handing in your manuscript and waiting for revisions. It's a lot.
It's a lot, and I only have myself to blame for this. It's a big book. It was very challenging, but I'm eager to turn it in and then just have a week to celebrate We Shall Be Monsters and hang out with friends and readers. And yeah, I think it'll be great.
Yeah, definitely celebrate that win.
Well, thank you so much, Tara, for joining us and talking to us about the book. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And that was Tara Sim. We Shall Be Monsters is available now at booksellers everywhere, including, as always, the Books and Boba bookshop. So you can check out our bookstore by going to booksandboba.com. All purchases made there support not only the Books and Boba podcast, but also your local bookstore. I guess before we go, Rira, can you remind us what we are reading for book club for July 2024?
Yeah, sure. So we are reading The Sense of Wonder by Matthew Salasis, and it is a look at the ways Asian Americans navigate the thorny worlds of sports and entertainment when everything is stacked against them. And it mainly centers around an Asian American basketball star. And it's been a while since I don't think we've read a book where the main character is an athlete. Right, Marvin?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think we had student athletes, but not like professional.
Yeah, so it's a first for us.
It sounds like this story takes a lot of inspirations from the Linsanity phenomenon back in 2013, 2014.
Yeah, the 2010s, yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into this book with all of you. As always, if you're a Patreon supporter, you can read along with us on Discord, where we'll be discussing the book weekly. And if you have finished the book and have thoughts to share, please let us know on Goodreads or on Discord, so we can include your thoughts on our end-of-month podcast discussion. But with that, that'll do it for this episode of Books and Boba. Thank you once again to Tara Sim for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Books and Boba. This podcast was hosted by Marvin Yue and Rira Yu and edited and produced by Marvin Yue. Follow the book club on Twitter and Instagram by going to @BooksandBoba and engage with us on Goodreads on our Goodreads group. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast by going to booksandboba.com and by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget, you can support Books and Boba and Asian American authors by purchasing books at our bookshop.org account. Check out the link in our show notes and also at booksandboba.com. Books and Boba is a proud member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, a collective of Asian American hosted podcasts featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian diaspora. Learn more about the collective and check out our fellow Potluck shows by visiting the website podcastpotluck.com. Thanks for listening.
Co-host the podcast Asians in Baseball alongside Naomi Ko and Scott Okamoto. Asians in Baseball is exactly what it sounds like. A podcast about the Asian and Asian Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Americans in Major League Baseball. Every week, we break down the highlights of what's going on with Asians in baseball and then take a deeper dive into the Asian and Asian Americans past and present who have shaped baseball as it is today. Whether you're Kim Eng's #1 fan or you've never even heard of Hideo Nomo, we've got something for everyone, especially for the Shohei Ohtani stans. Maybe too much for the Shohei Ohtani stans. Listen to Asians in Baseball wherever you get podcasts, part of the Potluck Podcast Collective.